This is part 2 of our audio podcast where we talk to Kate Käufer about the budget process, particularly on how to reform the budget process so that it's more responsive to departments' needs with dealing with emerging technology. So let's move over and talk about some of the budget reform ideas that have been out in the world in the last, especially 5 to 10 years. We on the Hill went after acquisition reform in lots of different ways. Mostly it was going after contract types and contract reform and program structures and things like that. But recently there's been the PPBE Commission, which I actually was a member of, a bunch of think tank studies, and lots of other folks who've written about budget processes and financial management reform, all as parts of efforts to improve DOD's ability to buy things, right? The acquisition system and its ability to engage with this burgeoning commercial sector that wants to work with defense. So from your perspective, you were watching all of this go by and playing a big role in certainly pieces of it. Looking back now, do you feel like we've made any progress that's actually moving things in a positive way?
It's a big question, Arun. Let's break it down. Let's see if we can break it down a little bit. So let's start with the acquisition reform piece. You're the resident expert on that. But I would say a lot of different acquisition tools and associated funding mechanisms have been enacted really since probably 2016-ish.
Yeah, the 10-year anniversary of when some people came back to town and got started on this.
Am I going to get invited to that party? So a lot of efforts have been made over the last 10 years, and I think we now have a sufficient body of work to see what works and what doesn't work. And when I say what doesn't work, I think you need to be careful because you really want to understand what some of the impediments were to success. I was heartened to see both the Secretary of Defense as well as the White House issue directives on acquisition, on the use of acquisition tools. But I was also concerned that they felt the need to restate them because, to your point, these tools have been out for almost 10 years now. And so are they not being utilized? Are they not being utilized well? I think now is a really, really good time to look back at what works, what doesn't work, and why, and maybe what modifications need to be made there. On PPBE, let me say, first of all, and I'm not just saying that because you were on the commission, but I think the commission did an outstanding job. I think they did an outstanding job of collecting data and presenting a near complete picture of what all goes into planning, programming, budgeting, and executing defense funding. They were incredibly proactive. They met with a lot of stakeholders, and I think that's reflected in the final report. That value, just from an education perspective, I think is significant. When people talk about PPBE reform, I always want to know what aspect they're actually talking about, right? Because it is such a cumbersome mechanism that, I always, when I'm asked to describe it, I compare it to, describing an elephant. And depending on whether you touch the elephant's trunk or his ears or his legs, you're going to describe the elephant differently. And that's what I think about PPBE because it has so many different aspects to it. I think the most important thing to recognize is that PPBE was established by the Department of Defense. They own it. And so they have a lot of ability to make changes to that process. And so I am curious to see what the administration will put forward in terms of proposals on how to your point, right, get at that front 2 years of the budget process, how to condense that process a little bit.
One of the things that struck me over working on the commission is how much of a shared system PPBE is between different parties, the services and OSD, the Pentagon and Capitol Hill, everybody and the White House, the government and industry. Everyone has different roles to play, whether you're doing the planning, the programming, the budgeting, or the execution. And the dominant players change as you move through that process.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people on all those different places don't realize how much of a shared system it is and that everyone is trying to optimize for something different. But I think the commission walked away with, well, if we could all just sort of acknowledge that it's a shared system and talk more frequently and more openly, and at least work off the same set of data, you might help the department plan better, understanding where the Congress is going to, I'll call it, budget and appropriate. And you certainly will all benefit from understanding industry's needs on execution, because more and more they're bringing their own money to the table on all of this. And so it's so interrelated and complicated.
You hit the nail on the head. If we can solve just the data piece, that would be a huge benefit in and of itself. Saving time, facilitating communication, facilitating data exchange. If we could get after that, that would be transformational.
There is also, over the last few years, a lot of attempted cleverness on giving the department more ability to move money, maybe at the speed of threat, the speed of technology. One of the ones that I remember you were very involved in was what's called Budget Activity 8, which is kind of also called the software color of money. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about that story. Where did that come from? How do you think it's going? Where would you like to see it go?
I think that's a really good case study. It's a good example of the department and Congress working together. So the department, a couple years ago, came up with this idea of a software pilot. Worked with the Congress to get it established for certain programs. Congress, was cautious, but went along with it. And then it took DOD a couple years to not so much make use of it, but show the value of it. Congress, they always ask for information, right? They always want data. Like, show me that this authority that you're getting, in this case, the software color of money, gives you agility and speed that you would not otherwise have, and that this added agility and speed leads to better warfighter outcomes.
And it's not being malicious.
No, it is their job. And bear in mind, right, what we talked about at the very beginning, you have a dozen congressional staff reviewing the entire DOD budget. And so they only have so much time to dig deep on the issues, right? And that's where all these reporting requirements and requests for data come from. And so that's what's behind it. No one wants to create more work for anybody. It's just wanting to have a clear picture of what is actually happening. And so it took DOD a couple years to capture the data and make their case. But when they did, and they came back and said, okay, we would like to expand this pilot for certain issues, Congress actually went along with it. And so it is one example of the Department of Defense and Congress working together. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems. But I think it shows what you can accomplish when you communicate frequently, and when you allow the process, when you give the process a little bit of time to play out.
Yeah, and there was other cases of success recently, some of which stem from commission recommendations, where changes in the department's ability to move money around after the appropriations bill is done, in techno speak, below threshold reprogramming. And so the appropriations committees, I think, reacted to that, and you guys did something.
Yeah, I think two major initiatives are, one is, once the department submits their budget, there is a little bit of a perception that they have to, stick with that plan, and they can't talk to Congress about what may or may not have changed. In reality, that's just not accurate, right? Right up until the very end of the legislative process, the appropriations committees engage with DOD senior leaders at the OSD level, at the service level, to make sure that they got it right, to make sure that what DOD has identified as their needs, 2 years ago, or a couple months earlier when the budget comes over, based on a 2-year process, that those needs are still accurate. So there is a very lively back and forth even before the legislation gets enacted. And then, to your point, after enactment, DOD has the opportunity to move money around, and that ability has actually been increased in recent years. Now, there's always going to be someone who says we need to do more, right? We need more flexibility. That can be a double-edged sword. And anytime someone wants to make the case for more flexibility, the very first question that Congress is going to ask is, what problem is it that you are trying to solve? And let's solve that specific problem. And as long as you can continue to have that dialogue, I think you're going to continue to move the ball forward in helping make DOD more efficient and effective.
So those are examples of changes that have been made recently. What else would you have the world take on at this point to reform financial management systems or budget and appropriations processes?
Well, if you think about DOD's three major decision systems, right? We talked about acquisition reform. There's probably always more that can be done there. We talk about PPBE, which is happening on an iterative basis. Then there's the requirements piece, which is solely owned by the warfighter and an area where the Armed Services Committees are very active. What does that requirements process look like, and how do we make the requirements process such that it is more reactive while still being able to inform the acquisition and budget process in a helpful way? I think that's a key step. The second element is that DOD used to conduct a much more rigorous internal budget review before the budget came over. At the OSD level, that's gone away, and I think that's led to a little bit of erosion of finding the budget efficiencies. It puts a lot more onus on the Congress to find the budget efficiencies. Congress clearly has to get back to an on-time enactment of appropriations bills. And the other challenge that Congress faces is, you pass an annual appropriations bill, but you're doing it in the context of, a national defense strategy that's written over 4 years, mid and long-term budget planning. And so how can Congress reconcile kind of the strategic long-term approach with having to pass an annual appropriations bill, especially in those areas where you need a systemic investment? So be it in the workforce, be it in the supply chain, certain acquisition programs that take years to develop and build. So think certain shipbuilding programs or highly sensitive space programs. That is a challenge that Congress has to wrestle with, and where the high turnover among members and staff that we have seen over the last 5 or 6 years erodes Congress's ability to think a little bit more or act more, kind of more on that strategic approach. And I'm hoping that can be regenerated a little bit.
And then there's the reality, right? The elected officials on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch are responsive to constituents,
of course,
and constituent interests. And so some of the puts and takes are going to necessarily be driven by what members of constituents of those representatives want, right? So that's, in the old days, we call those earmarks, and those haven't gone away. I mean, in some form, they exist, and so there's still that going to be part of the process.
It is. It accounts for a small part of the budget, maybe 1% or so.
And it doesn't increase the top line.
It doesn't increase the top line. And I will tell you from my experience, a lot of these earmarks ultimately lead to innovation on the technology space. I think in general, Congress is a lot more willing to try or to embrace risk on the S&T base, on the prototyping base, on the innovation base, probably more so than the department is. And so having that healthy balance and somewhat healthy tension, I think is a good thing overall.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you look at it as much more industry and market informed than sometimes a budget build process in the Pentagon is.
That's fair.
It these days can also be informed by private capital interest, who also get to talk to the Hill and say, we're going to be investing a lot in this kind of area, and we just need some cost share. And it's got the speed advantages that we talked about earlier. You can actually, in more real time, reflect current threat, current emerging technology opportunity.
I think there's a huge market there, and DOD ought to try to tap into some of that capital. What I'm seeing is, as these conversations are happening, is that industry, the capital markets, Congress, Department of Defense tend to speak a bit of a different language. And so a lot of what needs to be happening is just educating each other on processes, requirements, why DOD's needs are different than commercial needs. So how do you adapt some of those commercial technologies to satisfy DOD requirements? But I think there's a lot of opportunities there with a little bit of education and patience can really be game changers.
So that's a perfect segue to my last couple of questions here. So when you're thinking about those new entrants,
Mm-hmm.
and you work with them now in your new endeavor,
Mm-hmm.
how should they be prepared to deal with an entity like DOD as a customer?
Mm-hmm.
Very different kind of place than its commercial customers, especially given how it handles its money. What are some things they should think about going into this?
Well, I think one, it starts with communication, and bear in mind that communication is a two-way street. You can have the coolest, hippest technology, but if it doesn't address a DoD need, right? DoD ought not and won't be interested in it. And so communication also starts with listening to what DoD actually needs, and then seeing if you as the non-traditional vendor have a means to address that challenge. I think so. That I think is number one key. Second key is you got to perform, right? If you're going to promise that you're going to be delivering a capability, you got to do it, right? You got to do it on cost, on schedule, preferably under cost, under schedule, or ahead of schedule. So accountability and responsibility are huge factors here, and these performance metrics, they matter, right? DoD, companies have cultures and reputations, just like DoD and the services have, and all the major stakeholders are aware of those, right? And past performance matters, and so I think that is really, really critical as we try to bring in a new cast of entrants, of technology entrants. And folks in DoD who are learning about this business model, unless they don't understand where each other are coming from and what language each other are speaking, I don't know how we can be successful. And so I really hope that this dialogue can be facilitated going forward.
All right, last question, circling back to the very beginning. Mysterious place, these appropriations committees. The Hill in general is kind of a scary place for industry members and small businesses, in particular universities, to approach. But industry always seems to, in some ways, be the victim of all of this legislative branch, executive branch wrangling over budgets and appropriations, as well as they're wrangling over the financial management reform and rules that we talked about. So what's your advice on, in the same way that they think about dealing with the Hill on contracting reform, what can NDIA members, universities do to influence any of these kinds of policies? And, especially those smaller and newer companies, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, one, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And two, you got to show up, right? You got to communicate to the Hill. These staff are stretched so thin. If they don't hear from you, they don't recognize that there is a problem. The advantage that industry and new entrants have over the Department of Defense is their ability to respond quickly to questions, and you ought to tap into that. And you ought to provide the information to the Hill, preferably in a digestible format. But you can't expect the Hill to take your concerns into consideration if they don't know what they are. That said, Hill staff, certainly those on the Congressional Defense Committees, are among some of the smartest staff that I know. I may be biased, but they're incredibly smart. And so when you go to talk to them, be prepared to have a frank and direct and honest conversation. They're not looking for your top line talking points. They're really trying to understand the nitty-gritty, the nuances of how different contract mechanisms work or don't work, how different acquisition authorities work, why the flow of funds is being delayed. I said at the very beginning, Appropriations Committee staff solve problems. They can't solve the problems unless they know what they are. And so I would task you and your NDIA member organizations to show up.
Kate Käufer is the president and founder of KMK Global Strategies and a dear colleague of mine for many years on the Hill and a friend as well. Thank you so much, Kate, for that great conversation.
Thanks, Arun. Anytime.
Thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Emerging Tech Horizons. I want you all to visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series. Please visit our YouTube channel at Emerging Tech ETI to see all of our past podcasts, our webinars, and all of our other content. We are especially excited to announce that the website for the third NDIA Emerging Technologies for Defense Conference and Exhibition, which is going to be held August 27th through 29th at the DC Convention Center, is now open. You can find that website at www.ndiatechexpo.org. We're working with a number of organizations in the Department of Defense to build the programming for that conference, including OSD, the CDAO, the Chief Digital and AI Office, the military departments and services, defense agencies, UCOM, AFRICOM, and other COCOMs. We're putting together a great set of keynote sessions, breakout panels, technical presentations. It's all designed to let you see the latest administration initiatives and partnership opportunities and share your great ideas and technical innovations that are shaping the future of national defense. We're also working on a hackathon at the event, an exhibit floor, lots of networking opportunities, including receptions, government industry, speed dating, and much more, all of which will make this an event that should not be missed. And Kate says she's going to be there, right, Kate?
100%.
Kent will be there. Agenda and registration information will be coming soon, again, to www.ndiatechexpo.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to like our episodes and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of our latest content. As you know, we're available on YouTube and anywhere where you find your podcast. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this podcast. Thanks again for tuning in to Emerging Tech Horizons.